What's up? Christy Winla, Fellowship for Followers of Christ. Here reading Chapter 9, Suicide and Guilt from Living with a Wild God by Barbara Ehrenreich. My mother's first suicide attempt in early September 1964 barely grazed me, which is to say that I successfully fended it off. I didn't give much thought at this point to other people's emotional states, except as a subject for theoretical speculation, and least of all hers, probably since I'd expended so much of my childhood energy trying to avoid being sucked into her personal vortex of anger and disappointment. This is another place where we diverge. I have always been so critically aware of everyone else's emotions and how I affect their emotions. And it hurts my heart to hurt anyone else's heart. Like, it hurts me so badly to know that I've hurt anyone, even those who have hurt me. And that makes it difficult to defend myself, but just difficult to stand up for myself and assert what I deserve in a situation, especially when I'm dealing with abusers. Because I genuinely care even about abusers. You piss me off, but I still care. That was 111. I might have told you that there were other far more vivid things going on in my new life as a graduate student in New York City, things that distracted me from the spectacle of her decline. And there were, but insofar as I can identify my own feelings at the time, I just didn't care. The literary precedent, although it didn't occur to me then, is The Stranger by Camus. Camus? I'm going to have to look that one up. Which opens with the lines, "Mother died today," or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. In high school, I had fretted over the possibility that I was mentally ill, but in the wake of my mother's near-drowning experience, I faced a less flattering diagnosis, that I was selfish and mean. It was my mother's sister, Jean, who articulated the accusation, calling to tell me that my mother had just survived a suicide attempt. And where had I been when she needed me? Apparently, my mother had loaded up on alcohol and sleeping pills before walking off a pier at Atlantic City, where she had been an alternate delegate at the Democratic Convention, but had flailed around in the water enough to be noticed and rescued. She had repeatedly tried to call me before attempting to take her own life, according to Jean, who had once loved me enough to name one of her daughters after me, and was now yelling at me over the phone about the moist, smothering concept of responsibility. I was horrified, although not on account of my mother, I am sorry to say, but because I had discovered in Jean a vantage point from which I was not a bold existential seeker, just as my mother had so often suggested, a cold, aloof person unfit for human company. Jean's tirade rested on the assumption that I would have dissuaded my mother from trying to kill herself, but anyone could see that she was spiraling toward ruin in one form or another. She had gotten no alimony or settlement of any kind from the divorce, either because she was too proud or inept to fight for it, or because there never really was much money there, just the illusion of wealth created by my father's expense account. Yeah, my mom didn't fight for anything either. She never fought for anything except to steal my inheritance. So she was working at various retail jobs while trying half-heartedly to keep my teenage brother and sister out of trouble. She was also drinking recklessly and bringing men home from bars to the dismay of my little sister. Sometime in early 1964, she and my siblings had decamped from LA to Ames, Iowa, for the putative support offered by her sister and her mother, the latter having moved from Butte to Ames when Jean went through her own breakdown a few years earlier and became temporarily unable to take care of her children. Seems like an epidemic, huh? The move to Iowa soon led to tensions between my mother and Jean, my favorite aunt, the one who had taught me how to smoke cigarettes a few years earlier. Don't be that aunt. Because I suspect Jean was embarrassed to have anyone as risque as a divorcee sloshing into her respectable life. Dude, you've had enough of my attention. You need to get over yourself. I love you so much, but I'm busy right now. He's being a butt face. Jean's husband was a doctor, a Republican, an Episcopalian, and a collector of Civil War memorabilia. While my mother, with her drinking and atheism, was almost bohemian by Ames's standards, intolerant and mercurical, once even getting drunk at a social gathering and picking a theological fight with the Episcopalian minister. Ooh. That's one thing my mom would never do. I don't think she'd be that bold. She only gets drunk and picks fights with me and anyone who's, tolerant enough to continue to stay around her when she gets drunk. In her own home, which she never leaves. In the early summer of 1964, she cut her child-raising responsibilities in half by sending my 13-year-old sister back to LA to be raised by my father and his second wife, a move that replicated her own abandonment as a child, not perfectly but near enough. On my occasional visits to Ames, I was expected to participate in the new ritual she had developed since her divorce. She had always liked to smoke and drink and talk into the evening. Ugh. Yeah. It's so frustrating when your own mother expects you to be her therapist. Also, she's not actually working anything out. She's just venting in a drunken stupor and then doesn't remember it and then repeats the exact same thing the next night. Holla if you hear me. Where were we at? And talk into the evening, and now she did so compulsively with minimal encouragement, as single-mindedly as a solitary writer sitting down to fill a blank page. In fact, I think this was her equivalent of writing, or at least her way of organizing a narrative out of the scraps. After the dinner dishes had been put away, she poured us drinks, highballs they were called, meaning possibly 7 and 7s. And sat me down for a nonstop monologue of themes on her selection. It was gratifying, in a way, to be treated as an equal and offered my own ashtray and drink. Yeah, I get it, but not good. Or at least restored to my early childhood role as confidant. But I would find the next morning that I had no memory of what she had said. The plots were too tangled, the personae were too similar, the undertone of resentment too uniform. I wish I could say I had no memory of what my mom said, but mostly she would vent about things that she actually did to me that she decided were traumas that were inflicted upon her by me. Like forcing me to have an abortion at 14 years old was traumatic for her, and it was messed up that I put her in that situation, that she had to endure the trauma of murdering her own grandchild. That's my mom. One theme I can recall had to do with people who had slighted her in some way or seemed to look down on her, and there were a lot of people in that category, if only because she didn't have a college education and now not even a husband or a house of her own. My mom doesn't even have a GED. God bless her soul. But then these people always turned out to be shallow and ignorant themselves, as evidenced, for example, by the complete absence of books in their homes. She's someone who doesn't keep books in her home either. Or she used to read. There was a time when my mom used to read. There was a time when my mom used to do a lot of things. Like, she genuinely had a fledgling of a good character that could have developed. And I tried my best to help her to develop it. But she would not give up her addiction to toxic males. She just wouldn't. Not to mention her addiction to alcohol, tobacco, and other harmful substances. But the toxic males especially. Where were we at? Or she would retrace the narrative of her own sad existence, from her lonely childhood with her grandparents to her betrayal by my father, always ending in sodden despair. Because although she couldn't expect me to understand this, given how above it all I always pretended to be, a woman is nothing without a man. Eventually, these monologues got her in trouble, or at least a tiny small-town version of trouble. She befriended a young woman in Ames who, like me, she plied with liquor and recruited as an audience. But this woman, who may have been a graduate student in English, I can't remember, turned out to be a traitor and a spy. A few weeks into their apparent friendship, she published a barely disguised story of my family in some, needless to say, obscure local literary magazine, and there it all was, not elegantly written, but faithfully rendered. The heroic rise out of Butte, the scramble for material comfort, the decline into adultery, and though it was perfectly evident without being mentioned by name, alcoholism. It made a good story in the American tragedy vein. with its arc of success and disillusionment, but it was all too recognizable, including some friends of Jean's. My mother processed her humiliation by incorporating the story into her monologues as one more example of betrayal and occasion for bitter tears. 2 or 3 hours into one of these sessions, and I would have to fight the impulse to say, "You can stop right there. There's no need for any of this to continue." Isn't that the thing, 1010? Isn't that the thing? We hold our tongue and let them vent, and then the second I would start to speak any truth at all to my mother, the second I would start to speak any truth about my position on any of it, "I don't want to talk about this anymore." Same with my father. My dad, the second I will listen to him go on and on and on and on and on. "I'm out of debt, I got everything paid off, blah, 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 never once asking me, do I need anything? Could I use any help? And God forbid I should ask him for anything, because that means I would owe him my life. He's probably still talking about that $100 he gave me towards the down payment of my first car, which is literally the only time he ever came through for me in my whole entire life. But the second I would start talking about myself, that's when he would get off the phone. And I learned very early on that if I ever wanted to get my dad off the phone, all I had to do was start talking about myself. Boom. Conversation ended. So, no offense, Dad, but if you wonder why I don't bother to call you on your birthday, aside from the fact that you always intentionally forget mine and then blame me for that, what's the point? Where are you when I need anything? Where are you when I need a father? So it may be just as well that my mother couldn't reach me when she was on the verge of killing herself, because if she had gotten Maudlin over the phone, as she almost surely would have, I might have told her that there are situations in which suicide is the most rational choice, and that I could certainly understand. The reason she couldn't reach me is so bizarre that I didn't even try to tell Jean. For reasons connected to my increasing distaste for lab work, I had spent the last few weeks of the summer in Istanbul, the period when my mother was in Atlantic City, attending an international summer school in quantum chemistry with no regular access to a phone. I do have to say 1212. I have to say real quick, I feel terrible because there was one moment in my mother's decline after losing my stepdad when she reached a point where she said, "You know what, I think it might be time to give it up for good," talking about alcohol. And because I was also in such a place at the time, I didn't understand that I was enabling her by I wasn't trying to encourage her to continue drinking. I thought that I was trying to encourage her to not think so badly of herself, to not put herself down, that, it was understandable what she was going through and that her behavior wasn't as bad as it was, because that's what, you know what I mean? We had been basically taught in life to minimize the bad behavior of the older folks around us, of the adults around us. And so I minimized her drinking, and I convinced her that she was okay and that we would get through this together, instead of allowing her to accept the fact that she had become a hardcore alcoholic who was on the way to ruining her own life completely, not to mention mine and that of my children as well. I didn't see the train wreck coming, because unfortunately I was also in my cups. Way more than I wanted to be, because I had to be 1333. I had to be, in order to tolerate these late night and early morning therapy sessions with my mother. I was trying to help her heal. My intention was to help her heal. I did not realize I was enabling her and destroying myself in the process. Why quantum chemistry in Istanbul? Well, almost a year earlier, in some kind of spasm of hubris and denial, I had presented myself at Rockefeller University in New York as a graduate student in its fledgling theoretical physics department. At the time, I had my reasons. I was still trying to get to the bottom of things, to the reductionist roots from which all phenomena arise, and furthermore, I knew that unless Rockefeller acquired a linear accelerator, there would be no possibility. He can't stand it when I'm not giving him information or attention. 1424. Unless Rockefeller acquired a linear accelerator, there would be no possibility of laboratory work, because most of what went on in this physics department concerned subatomic particles. But I realized at some level that this choice of subject matter was insane, like taking up a career as a novelist, only in Chinese. I spent the first few months of graduate school pretending to be a student of theoretical physics. This required no great acting skill beyond the effort to appear unperturbed in the face of the inexplicable, which is, as far as I can see, one of the central tasks of adulthood. But it didn't take long before I admitted defeat. In college, I had gone from chemistry to physics, moving purposefully, I felt, from the complicated to the ever more fundamental, from the macro to the micro, and below that to the nano and the pico. Throughout my education, I had always managed to make up for a sketchy background through heroic bouts of study, but this didn't work when the subject was strangeness, or the fundamental symmetries of nature. I realized that if I was going to continue as a graduate student at all, and thus continue to receive my fellowship, I would have to reverse course. Oh, I hope I'm not covering my speaker while I'm talking. Whatever. I would have to reverse course and ascend the ladder of complexity all the way up to biology, which was, after all, Rockefeller's central area of endeavor. I would not go as far as organisms, I promised myself, and their baroque proliferation of strategies and shapes. I would stick as close as I could to the clean edges of chemistry. The organization of lab work was, and still is, entirely futile. A lab was not only a place or a room or a series of rooms, it was the fiefdom of a particular scientist. To go into a lab as a grad student was to apprentice yourself to this scientist, with the idea that you would, after several years of patient toil, ascend to a similar rank yourself, at which point you would be able to offload the manual labor to people more junior than yourself. Yes, I'm not interested in climbing the hierarchical ladder, especially in a genre which is getting all of its information from me to begin with. Like, I don't understand why I should have to go and study as an apprentice and a graduate student from professors who learned what they're teaching from me. That's my issue. After escaping from physics, I was snatched up by a rising member of the scientific bourgeoisie, the immunologist Gerald Edelman, who was thought to be a genius and whose lab already contained about a half dozen eager graduate students and at least as many postdocs. I'm not saying there's not still things for me to learn. I'm saying I'm not interested in paying someone to teach me something I already taught them. I was attracted by his mad intensity, not always distinguishable from mere ambition, as when he told me and another potential student that you're not really doing science unless you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night screaming. At first I was flattered to be offered a place in such a popular state-of-the-art laboratory and delighted to be assigned to the fashionable study of protein conformational changes, which was my first exposure to chemistry as a three-dimensional undertaking. Proteins are long chains of linked amino acids folded into specific conformations or shapes that determine their ability to function within a cell, so their foldings and unfoldings are essential to the chemistry of life. But it didn't take long to figure out that I had really been assigned to a machine. The spectrofluorometer that we use to analyze the fluorescent light emitted by dyes chemically attached to the proteins under study, which occupied most of a dark closet-sized room off one of the main laboratories. I discovered just how tightly I was meant to be attached to this machine one evening a couple of months into my tenure at the lab when I was preparing to leave for the day at Edelman. And Edelman stepped into my closet and asked if I understood how much the spectrofluorometer had cost. Because at that price, he explained, he needed it to be running 14 hours a day, at least 6 days a week, or some other improbable length of time. This is what science had come down to. Heads of laboratories getting grants to buy machines that would then come to dictate the research agenda of their laboratories. Money. Take money out of everything. Money in science, money in politics, money in medicine. Money needs to stop being the basis of everything because literally, this desire, this greed, this money is the root of all evil. Why were we studying the use of fluorescent dyes to track conformational changes in proteins? The primary reason seemed to be that we had the equipment to do it, and the equipment could not be wasted. I told Edelman it was Friday night and I had a date and was going anyway, but I left with the feeling that my days of being a free-floating intellect were over, that I had become something more like a machine tender or a 19th century mill worker in Lowell. So when sometime in the spring of 1964 I saw an announcement for the quantum chemistry summer school, I couldn't resist. The exotic setting, the chance to fill in this yawning gap in my chemistry education with a new view of the world expressed entirely in wave functions. Edelman objected, correctly interpreting the trip as a vacation. But I wasn't going to spend my summer in a closet when I could be outdoors or at least someplace absolutely foreign. Exactly. That's why I was upset when you blocked my trip to the Pacific Northwest to learn how to teach survival and wilderness skills to children. Because I wanted to learn something new and valuable that I could bring back here and teach to the students I already had. But instead, and I needed that. I needed that break from my job because I was getting burned out at my job and I was aware of that. But instead, you blocked that opportunity from me and then fired me from my job for something I didn't even do. Even though I was literally the best employee you had. Ridiculous. So when sometime in the spring of 1964, apologies, I was already there. There wasn't any wilderness in my life anymore, even on the margins, and if I wanted to explore new places, I had to make an effort to get to them. That's how I ended up in Istanbul when my mother was reportedly trying to reach me, though I was probably not actually at a lecture on quantum chemistry, which turned out to be even more opaque than theoretical physics. Or at least there'd been a few flashes of lucidity. When she was calling me, if she had indeed been trying to reach me, I was most likely wandering the streets of Istanbul trying to fill the time when the lectures were going on until I could return unnoticed to the dormitory and whatever book I was reading at the time. These walks were challenging in their own way because I was in no way prepared for the hostility of the Turks once you got away from the main tourist square. The cold stares at my bare arms and ankles, the complete absence of places to sit down, get a snack, or use a toilet. But it was better to walk than to sit and watch the tridents representing wave functions march across the blackboard to a sound of broken English. Jean didn't know the full story of my dereliction. My crime, since that's how she saw it, was not that I was missing during my mother's crisis. In fact, there had never been any understanding between my mother and me that we needed to keep in touch or even know each other's phone numbers and general locations at all times. If there was a crime here, it was something Jean couldn't have known about and that I only uncovered within the last year. In the course of trying to create a personal historical timeline for the summer of 1964, also known as Freedom Summer, there was quantum chemistry starting in the middle of August, then the Democratic Convention at the end of August. What I had forgotten or somehow misplaced in time was that my mother had come to visit me for a week or so in New York before going on to the Democratic Convention. This was to be her only visit during my 5 years in graduate school, and it would have been my chance to bond with her, to go out to ethnic restaurants, and maybe, if the tickets didn't cost too much, sample the emerging, TikTok's trying to distract me, no thank you, the emerging off-Broadway scene. Maybe I even imagined doing these things with her as a vivacious and only slightly tipsy companion, but when she actually showed up, I retreated into my traditional revulsion and arranged to keep our contact to a minimum. I didn't want to drink with her. I didn't want to get trapped by a monologue. So I worked long hours in the lab and devoted most of my evenings to my latest boyfriend, leaving my mother to fend for herself in the local bars or my bare little apartment, where there must have been nothing to do but drink and contemplate her manifest uselessness to the human race. God bless. I kind of understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, had I ever made it out of this, I shouldn't say godforsaken town. I actually love Knoxville. I genuinely do. I love my city. I just never got to leave it. I never got to leave it and explore and learn and grow somewhere else so that I could bring that back here to help grow here. Do you know what I mean? That's what's frustrating. But if I had ever gotten to go away to college and if my mom had ever cared enough to come see me, I would have dropped everything and devoted my time to making sure that she had the time of her life, because that's how much I love my mother and how much I would have appreciated the effort that she made to actually come see me somewhere else and not hold me back from ever getting there in the first place. Jean, if she'd known about my behavior during this visit, would have piled still more guilt onto me. But guilt is a pious sort of emotion, inappropriate to the present cast of characters. As a child, I had learned many things from my mother, like how to sew a buttonhole and scrub a grimy pot. My mother never taught me anything. How to cuss. How to be abusive to others. How to consume toxic substances to my own detriment and that of those around me. God bless her, but that's the truth. But mostly I had learned that love and its expression are entirely optional, even between a mother and child. No deep mammalian genetic script compels a mother to take a little girl's proffered hand when they step out onto the street. No hormone requires her to respond to an adolescent's teary cri de coeur. I hope I'm saying that right. My upbringing may have been harsh, but it was also instructive. The idea of a cosmic loving kindness perfusing the universe is a serious, even potentially dangerous error, and I can thank my mother, however ruefully, for having made that clear long before it was my turn to brush her off. There is something else that could have contributed to the suicide attempt, an entirely unrelated drama unfolding. During the years when I was in college and without any evident input from actual, quote, Negro people, my mother had gotten emotionally swept up in the civil rights cause, part of a larger change in her that I saw only in distant outline. She read Thoreau and renounced materialism. She mourned Adlai Stevenson's exit from the 1960 Democratic Party to the extent that I, still a vigilant young anti-communist, wondered about her loyalty to America. See, I would have loved it if my mom would have cared about any of this stuff, if she would have taken a moment to grow and learn and change, but she just went from one toxic male to the next toxic male, to the next toxic male, to the next toxic male, to the next, and she's still to this day sitting on the couch next to a toxic male, smoking and drinking herself to death. Then, when she went to the 1964 Democratic Convention, she participated in the sit-in to demand recognition for the insurgent Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I would have been so proud of my mother. I would have been so proud to call her my mother, to know that she did those things. Or maybe she just wanted to participate and was shooed away, whether by the police or the sit-ins organizers, I don't know. She had had high hopes there anyway, for a few days or hours, until the party leaders sold out the insurgents in order to maintain the loyalty of the white Southern Dixiecrats. And it may have been this that sent her down to the pier after dark, because it is hard to believe that I pushed her in the death direction all by myself. I flew out to Iowa the day after Jean's call to visit my mother in the mental hospital she had voluntarily checked into. It was, oh God, I wish my mom would voluntarily check herself into a mental hospital. That would be amazing. It wasn't in Ames. I had to fly to Des Moines and rent a car, arriving sometime in the early evening. I expected a chastened and sober mother, or maybe even a cold and angry one, but when I got to the hospital, we were immediately joined by some new boyfriend of hers, who I think had driven from Ames, a jolly buzzcut guy in the gray suit of an assistant regional sales manager. Never mind the setting or the occasion for our gathering, we all went out to a bar where we drank until I slipped away to my hotel and the other two vanished into his car. They let you leave the mental hospital and go to a bar? That's crazy. I mean, I guess so, because I saw Girl Interrupted, but I don't know what psychiatric treatment modality was in place, but none of this seemed to require any stealth. Only when I got back from Iowa did I realize how seriously I had lost my way, not just as a daughter or a student, but as the author of my own existence, the leader of my own personal expedition. The quest I had pursued for years had ended in what could be interpreted as disaster, as some kind of breakdown, starting in Lone Pine. Then I had tried to find a fresh mission in science, in particular theoretical physics, and had failed at that. And now that I was toiling at the production end of science, where the big issues are the calibration of equipment and the stability of reagents, I had lost sight of the promised intellectual adventure. I didn't have a quest anymore. I had a job. See, I can't stand the thought of that. A place to go in the morning and stay on into the evening. A check coming every month, and what it was all leading to, when I allowed myself to think about it, was at best a lifetime of jobs. It's no coincidence that his name is Steve Jobs, just saying. I would be a postdoc and eventually a mediocre scientist with a small grant to support my allotted slice of the global research agenda. Maybe I would end up on the faculty of some Midwestern university with an office that looked out on the parched gray cornfields of winter, where I would pine for a chance to travel to a scientific meeting in some place like Urbana or Winston-Salem and present my little crumb of a research result. Kind of like how that therapist of mine, I mean, I genuinely still care for her because she was my therapist for so long, and as a human being, I care. And yes, she crossed boundaries, and we became friends and hung out, and she did things for me like loan me a vehicle when I needed a vehicle. So I think that it was mostly the dementia and or Alzheimer's that caused her to attack me in session. I don't think that it was as intentional as it felt. I think that most of the people who have wronged me haven't been quite as intentional as it seems. But also I understand that she was benefiting from me. She was benefiting from what she was learning from me, and she was using that to cancel sessions with me so that she could travel to seminars and conventions and go to all these places and gain all these accolades. And she was going to open up a Reiki studio and all of these things that she wanted to do that eventually it dawned on me, like, she's stealing from me. My therapist, I'm paying my therapist to steal from me. That's what was happening. I mean, technically my insurance was paying her, but still, like, what's that about, you know? I never got to go anywhere, and here she was puffing me up, talking about how I should run for president because I should run for public office, I should run for president. She would vote for me, for sure. But all the while taking everything that she was learning from me and using it to advance her own career at my expense, because half the time I needed her, she wasn't even there because she was gone to some convention somewhere, presenting my ideas that she took from me, probably. Like, what's that about? That's crazy. There was hardly any sky that winter or meteorology of any kind, and not just because I worked in a closet. Throughout Manhattan, the sky had been largely bricked off by buildings, and within the Rockefeller complex, a system of underground corridors allowed travel from one end to the other without going outdoors. When I did get a chance to look up at where clouds and sun and moon should be, the effect could be startling, leading me to write, for example, the following poem or fragment of a poem. Child, even this milkiest sky, sucked by too thirsty, ascending eye, will dry, not fold, will crack, and before it closes, you will see the night outside. I love your poetry. I would honestly rather be a poet than a scientist, although I feel like my brain was intended for scientific pursuits. There is no date on this, but it almost has to be from that despairing winter of 1964 when, in the midst of everything else, I was being let go by the older, eccentric, non-scientist boyfriend who had distracted me from my mother's visit during the summer. I knew things were coming to an end at Thanksgiving when he went home to his parents for the holiday, which was no more than a 2-hour train trip, without inviting me or even offering an excuse like familial insanity. It was 3313. I had dinner by myself in a diner, buoyed by the implicit drama, which I imagined I could read in the faces of others, of an attractive girl alone in the neon city on a holiday night. Thanks to my mother, though suicide was not an appealing option, even as a recreational thought experiment. Thanks to my mother, though, suicide was not an appealing option, even as a recreational thought experiment. There was the dark glamour if you could just get drunk enough to drown